Hi everyone. So today we're joined by Victoria Bones. Thanks, Victoria, for joining us today. So we get straight in, and we're just having a little chat about your experience joining the prison residencies. So could you tell us a little bit about your arts practice, please?
My practice is around ritual processes, ceremonial costume, and um, I usually say, which sounds slightly pretentious, but it narrows it down nicely, the kind of restrictions, the social and the economic restrictions placed on a woman's body.
It sounds really fascinating. And just from those sort of principles, how did you develop your idea for the prison project?
Through going through the historical research that we had in advance, so when we were speaking to Dave and all the information he gave us, sort of gathering that up, reading various books on women in prison and male prisoners. There was a male prisoner on death row. I read his account as well. Looking at as many documentaries and videos and just sort of gathering what I could to get a feel of what it might be like to be in prison for a period of time, how that would change your world, how that would affect you mentally, and sort of then starting to think about how would you cope, so how your mental health would be affected by being in prison, the different coping strategies. So that led me into thinking about movement, because movement, I'm a live artist, so physically moving around is part of my practice, and something that how the body moves and how the mind and body works together in movement is something that fascinates me. So thinking about the prisoners' days and when they would be allowed out of their cells and the space they had to move around in, as well as sort of regaining autonomy, I saw it as that when you were in your cell, that was your only time to kind of move around freely in such a tiny confined space. So I started to look at those things, but in a mark making way. That for me, that was an opportunity to do something new, was to kind of look more at mark making whilst moving through space.
It's really interesting, and definitely compared to a lot of the other artists, it was a different way of working. Obviously, you were performance-based artists, and from the research that you were looking into, was there anyone in particular kind of really stood out, like their stories really stood out for you, or was it sort of as a whole you could process everyone's sort of...
It was as a whole, it was looking at the work that's, because the women were only in the prison until, I say only, unfortunately in the prison until 1918. So they were, the enforced labour, which was sewing and laundry,
Yeah.
which kind of domestic work like that is part of, the subject matters I'm interested in because I work with fabric myself. And how they were allowed out into the exercise yard for just 1 hour a day, but they had to go regardless of weather conditions, and how that was even restricted then, that they couldn't just go into the exercise yard and move around freely, but they then had to walk with a mask over their face, a meter apart, which they held onto rope to make sure they were kept a meter apart, and they had to kind of really skim round the outskirts, the edge of the wall they had to walk around. So even when they had a bit of freedom, they didn't really have freedom.
Yeah.
But that was what fascinated me the most, this idea of silence and separation rather than one person's story, how silence and separation affected them, or could affect someone. And just sort of bringing that to today, connecting it with how we've all been through COVID-19, and we've all been kind of a little bit, well, not silenced because we have all this amazing technology, but how we've been separated and had to wear face masks to cover our mouths, and the prisoners there had to wear hessian sacks over their heads, so they were completely covered. So I did walk around the exercise yard several times, skimming the walls and the edges, and counted how many steps it was and how many steps around C wing and how many steps I could manage around my cell. So that idea of being covered and masked, and having to move in this so-called free way, which wasn't free at all, was really what interested me.
Yeah, and it's definitely very relatable for how, as you say, how we've all sort of been living and experiencing the last sort of 18 months or so with the pandemic. And it's quite frightening, really, the similarities between those two times, even though they're very different circumstances. Your work, you did produce a full costume. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you went from research to full making?
I guess I knew from the research, I knew I wanted to work on something that represented memory and an embodiment of memory. Reflecting on my own experience through COVID and considering how the prisoners would have been, or how someone in isolation, such severe isolation as that would be, we'd be left with our memories, good, bad, emotional baggage you might want but might not want, and how that's kind of a trail that we carry around with us anyway. So I bought up a lot of, scanned the car boot sales and bought up lots of items, used clothing. The ones that were working best were definitely kind of tops that had more texture, and women's clothing. I stuck with women and children's clothing because of the history of Seawing and, being the emphasis. So I gradually started to pin those together and sew them together. So I brought them all to the prison. I started to shred them a little bit beforehand, looked at different ways of kind of not aging, but trying to shred them, as I was thinking about fragments of memories. They say that we only remember something properly once, and then after that, all other versions are just remakes that are, hashed together badly with odd bits standing out rather than something else, and are just never true.
Yeah.
So we have this kind of haphazard mess of a memory of people in our lives and events, and I guess that's what I was trying to make. So I'd looked at different ways of shredding the fabric with sandpaper and knives and steel wool brushes and all sorts of things. My carpet looked a terrible mess before I came to the prison. So some of it, obviously, jumpers and wool fabrics were much easier to shred and tear. So destroyed some of them, tried to think about different, I did specifically shred specific parts of the garments. So I was looking at what you would remember the most. When you bring someone to mind, you don't necessarily remember their arms, but you remember their face and their torso. Yeah. So I was playing about with, on a shirt or a blouse, say, just keeping the collar and keeping the buttons and things. But it wasn't quite so successful when I cut everything else up. Anyway, I brought all those to the prison. I brought my big mannequin that I love, Maud, and had her out in the centre and started pinning the clothes together in different ways. So I pinned them, leaving quite big gaps in between them. They're a little bit more solid when they're closer to the body, because that was the idea of it being a newer memory and a fresher memory. And wanted, as the train kind of carried on, I wanted it to be more ripped and fragmented and faded towards the end of it.
Yes. Again, it's the whole process has been really fascinating to watch, and I just want to pick up on, you mentioned earlier that you really paced around the whole of the prison, including like the exercise yard. How did you feel just being within the prison environment? Because obviously it's very different to working at home or within a studio. So what was your overall sort of thoughts and feelings just being in that sort of environment?
It was a mixture. I mean, as a visitor and as an artist, it was exciting to have that opportunity to actually be in situ. You're not just installing a work, you haven't done research in the studio and then bringing it along to hang. It's a very different, you can really absorb the building and the visceral, it's a visceral experience rather than just a thinking one.
Yeah.
So yeah, the density of the building, the thickness of the walls, was very striking. The contrast of like how you're in this very small cell with tiny windows, and then as soon as you step out, the kind of, what do you call it, the sort of central space of the wing is vast. It's huge. You know, it's very, very tall, because it was, what, 3 stories. So that kind of odd tiny spaces in amongst huge spaces, and kind of multiple of small spaces in amongst something much bigger, was definitely kind of something, not something that's really I've gone into my work yet, but it's definitely something that stayed with me and I noticed. And then the exercise yard, you know, it was such a relief. Whenever I went out there, I really enjoyed being outside, regardless of the weather. Seeing the bits of weeds growing through the cracks, I wondered, you know, back in 1900s, you know, how much that would have happened. What, it's obviously tarmac on the ground out there now. I wondered what it would have been before, stone presumably. So seeing those little bits of nature coming through, how much that would have been just a relief, and, you know, something wonderful. And seeing the sky would be great, even though you were kind of just had tiny holes to look through in your mask, or the weave, the loose weave of the Hessian sacks. It was always nice to go in the exercise yard, even though I was kind of, I definitely just walked the perimeter. I walked as closely and tightly to the walls as I could. So it made a huge difference being there. I think the work would have gone off in a very different way, and I think, you know, the work I've made so far is just the beginnings. It's nothing complete, but I've now got that sense of the building and that experience in me to be able to reflect on and make more work. So that the costume so far, I was thinking about the density of the walls and thinking of possibly making it really, really thick. So piling up many more clothes and making it much denser to represent how thick those walls were.
So is this project something you see developing into new work, or as you just said, like continuing this sort of research? Is that something you hope for the future?
Yeah, definitely. For me, there wouldn't be any point in doing it otherwise, because I knew I wouldn't be able to, you know, 2 weeks is such a short space of time to make a completed piece of work. You know, it just doesn't, especially with the work I do, I often only make, say, 3 pieces a year, because it takes quite a long time to make the kind of ceremonial costumes, and then to work out the movement, and then, you know, have the opportunity to show the live piece. So yeah, the 2 weeks was just a kind of exploring, experimenting, getting a sense, absorbing, you know, making lots of notes. I did a lot of binding and knotting, so I had different kind of threads and bra strap and all sorts of things that I was tying around my hands as I walked, or knotting as I was counting steps walking. So I've now got all that in my studio. And all my initial triggers to make. I'd like to make a whole series of work around it, so it'll have, you know, some kind of large performance piece, ceremonial costume, and then it'll have all the smaller iterations that relate to it.
That's fantastic. And obviously you was in the prison not just with yourself, but there was other artists there as well. Was there any chance for having any collaborative projects at all?
Yes, that was really great. I mean, that was one of the wonderful things, having been in isolation for so long with ourselves. It was just really great to be not just with a group of other artists working, but because we were working all on the same kind of subject matter and themes, you know, due to the residency, then, you know, that made a huge difference. It meant that we had some great conversations that you just wouldn't have if you're working on your own, of ideas, different bits of research and history that, you know, we were able to share with each other as you were chatting. You know, I was sort of struggling to work in myself because it was so dark, and then I think it was Carrie who mentioned that the women obviously even also found that when they were having to do their textile work, so they were sitting in the doorways to work. So then it was like, all those little connections came about as a result of being in a group and being there. But collaborative pieces, so I had a load of very small bottles that someone gave me that I wanted to do something with, and I'd been a few weeks prior to going into the prison, I'd been playing about with putting different things in them and thinking about capturing essence of things, and because they're small and I'm used to working so big, it was a great challenge for me to work really small, sort of capturing little things and sealing the bottles with wax. I was thinking about secrets and whispers and things like that. And then when I got to the prison, I'd taken a whole load of them with me, and I sort of came up with the idea of an essence of memory. So I was trying to sort of capture that in the bottles with some of the fragments of and dust of the clothing as I was shredding it. And then I ended up giving them out to all the other artists and just saying, can you please fill this with an essence of memory? And that, your interpretation of that, or what that phrase means to you, is entirely yours. There's no restrictions on what you put in it, if anything. So really lovely. So I now have this shelf of bottles of all sorts of amazing things in, some that you can recognize, some that you can't. And that feels like an ongoing project for me. I think I've got a lot more bottles. I'm just going to keep going, giving them out to artists, women artists preferably, and with the same phrase, just building up a really big collection.
No, that's great. And have you been able to remember everything that's in the jars, as in what the memories are? Has that been a bit of a challenge?
No, well, I know what mine are. I can guess. Some people told me what they'd put in and some people didn't. So I think what I'm going to do is keep a little secret list of that I know are in the bottles. And then, because I'll just show it as a collaborative piece with everybody's name on as it grows, but I'll have this kind of secret list. I'm just going to put unknown in materials. But I'll have a secret list of what I think they are and the things that I know they are and which bottles they are.
So from that, then it sounds like you've got lots of different types of works and areas to go into. So what's coming up on the horizon for you now? Where do you see your work going?
I'm going to stick with that. I need to unpack everything. It's still all a bit of a mess in my studio. And make one corner dedicated to the prison residencies and the work that's come out of it. So I can sort of go into that space to work on that. I have some other bits of work I was playing with, so that'll be in the other corner of the studio. I like to kind of keep things. It can just get too confusing otherwise. I like to sort of keep things a little bit organized in my spaces so that I can go into that zone. Nothing specific on the horizon exhibition wise coming up. I just want to sit and play with all the stuff that's come out of the residency.
Well, you definitely did sit and play when you had your overnight stay at the prison. I just wanted to pick up on that. And how was that experience? Because obviously by the time you'd stayed overnight at the prison, you'd already been there 15 days. And obviously staying overnight, you'd been a whole other realm of seeing things in nighttime. Obviously it was very dark for you all. How was that experience of being there in the day and then being there at night as well?
Yeah, it was great. That really helped. I enjoyed it. I like the dark. I like the nighttime. I always feel like the nighttime gives you space to kind of think and exist and be, whereas the day is like very much a contemporary society, modern society of get things done, whereas then got space to kind of expand and kind of go into that other areas. So yeah, it was great. We did a tour, quite a late night tour with the prison officers who work there still. That was really good, really interesting. And then I had decided, because I'd playing with the costume piece I'd made, I wanted to put it on at midnight because a lot of the a lot of the overnight stays in the prison are based on ghost hunters and people being there for those kind of experiences. So I thought, well, I'll buy into that and play with it and see if I can frighten anyone, as you know, the trickster side wants to do those sort of things. So I did the costume on at midnight and completely veiled my face and walked around the first floor of Sea Wing. So I was just sort of walking around. I think I went around twice, but the costume's quite long, so it gets caught at times, so I have to kind of fiddle with it. But I was just sort of circling around. We videoed it and tried that out, and then, you know, it was so wonderful having the other women there, because I could say, what does that look like? Because obviously you can't, as a live artist, I can't see what I look like when I'm doing something.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, that's great, but I think we should turn the lights off. So then we turned off all the lights, and I was kind of walking around, and then someone had a torch that looked like a lamp. So I kind of held the lamp. So it was all very, you know, it's very cliched and playful, that I held this lamp with my face covered, this long grey dress type thing trailing behind me, and just walked in silence in a kind of meditative state around the first floor. And we did hear a group of women pass through our wing going, can you see that? Tell me that you can see that. You can see that, can't you? And then, so yeah, they couldn't quite decide if I was a living being or not, which was great fun. That was really good. Not that you know, not that I want that piece of work to be a kind of quite as playful as that. But it was a great opportunity to kind of mess around with that and experience it. So even though it was kind of in some ways very kind of silly, and I was also, when I walk around or do performance, I tend to be in a very meditative place. So I was really aware of that, especially because there was a story about one of the cells on that floor was where a woman had requested, I think she'd been jilted or something, I can't remember the whole story, but she'd requested her wedding dress and they brought it in, and she then hung herself in a cell. So I was very aware of that when I was walking around. So yeah, walking around in a meditative state, kind of with some respect for the history and the people who'd moved through the building, but at the same time being very playful to the ghost hunters that were running around.
Well, it's always good to give someone a little scare, isn't it? So it's always good to have a bit of fun.
The other thing that came out of, which I'm sure some of the others have said, came out of being there at night, was the pieces that we'd all started to hang in the main central area, lighting them differently. So once we turned the lights off and we had torches, we started to see those works very differently and play about with the lighting and how to light them and photographing them in that way. That was really exciting, and definitely something would never have happened in the daytime. We wouldn't have been aware.
Do you think doing like your midnight walk gave the work a different context for you? Did you have any other, like, did it change how you felt about it in any way by doing that performance at night?
Yeah, it became sort of more like reenacting a ghost kind of, you know, spirit kind of feeling, rather than it being about memory, about walking with memory. Because I had wanted to, the weather did sort of, even though I don't mind strange walking around in strange weather, it did pour the second week. So I'd finally got the costume to a point where I could wear it, and I wanted to walk around the exercise yard in it for an hour to kind of see what happened then. So wet that I didn't want to do it, because I wouldn't have been able to get changed and get warm again afterwards. So yeah, it went from being like a something that was about memory and reflection to being more of a pantomime ghost kind of situation.
Well, after all of that experience and research, and obviously, as you've mentioned, there's lots of scope for you to keep working on this project. It sounds like there's a lot of things to come out of it. So that's really good that it's been successful in making a new body of work for you. I just wanted to close off and just ask you if you had any other sort of thoughts or feelings or anything just to round up with you.
just that doing, doing the residency, working in the environment of your subject matter, that's really helpful. Being back in a group, especially a group of women. I prefer to work in groups of women, so that was great. I really enjoyed that. One of the other artists, Jo, her and I have realised we've got a lot in common. We have a lot of sort of dark aesthetic preferences. So we will be doing a collaborative piece, not necessarily about the prison, but it's meant that we've met each other and we want to work together on a few things in the future. So that's really exciting. It's given me a group of people to draw on that, in times of losing what I'm doing, as I start to work on new pieces around the subject or around the prison experience. I know that I can call on any of those women to help give me a bit of a crit and a bit of feedback on where I'm going, and because they now know my practice and we have the same body of knowledge of the experience and the history. So that's really cool. Yeah, makes me want to apply to things more, put aside all those how real life kind of steps in the way. Not real life, that's not a good term, is it? How the rest of life infringes things upon you and takes over your time, and yeah, I need to apply for more things instead of allowing children and responsibilities to get in the way.
Well, I wish you all the best, and do stay in touch with other people, and I really hope that these collaborations and future work really come into fruition, because it sounds brilliant. And yeah, just want to thank you for your time, and again, really pleased to hear that you enjoyed the experience. So thank you so much for today, and it's been great catching up with you, Victoria.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. A huge thank you to you and Luminara for creating the opportunity. It has made a huge difference and has got my practice back on track after not doing very much for a couple of years. So yeah, I'm really grateful. Thank you.
That's right, you're more than welcome. Thank you.